Good morning. Happy Sabbath. I hope you're doing good. The topic that we're going to be talking about today, I titled it The Sabbath. If you've been following the news, you know that there's a lot of conversations that are being taking place around the topic about what the Sabbath really is. And so today we're going to be looking primarily through the book of Hebrews, and we're going to be looking at why does Paul talk about the Sabbath in the book of Hebrews. And in the book of Hebrews, we believe, well, I personally believe that it's most likely that Paul wrote the book, although Bible scholars are not 100% sure who actually wrote the book of Paul, but most likely the book of Hebrews, but most likely the book of Hebrews was written by Paul. And so the book of Hebrews is written primarily for two groups of people. And as we go through the study, it is very possible that you're going to identify with one of two groups. And so we're going to be looking at the first group that the book of Hebrews talks about. And so the title for this message is The Sabbath, God's Answer for America's Mental Health Crisis and a Generation Ready to Give Up. So we're going to go ahead and go back to Psalm 46, verse 10. And in Psalms, David says, "Be still and know that I am God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth." I believe as a society, we tend to have, we struggle to be still, right? I was talking to a friend. He has a pretty intense job, and one of the way that he likes to wind down after a stressful day at work is to hop on his phone and scroll through his phone for a lot of time. And so as a society, we've come to be very comfortable with our devices, and it's very hard for us to actually stop and listen to the voice of God. And as we go through the book of Hebrews, we're going to see that this book speaks directly to us. In Matthew 11:28, it says, "Come unto me, all who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest." For the next slides, we're going to be looking at a couple of statistics on how is it that we're doing specifically as Americans here in the U.S. How are we doing when it comes to social media usage? And so we're going to see how this ties into the Sabbath topic. So this study was done in 2024, and it tells us that the average American screen time is approximately between 6 to 7 hours a day. And that's actually equal to 100 days a year on the screens. So how many days do we actually have in a year? We have 365. Out of those 365 days, the average American will spend a third of that amount of time on their screens. And of course, we can argue and say, well, most of the time that we spend on our screens are usually doing work, right? I believe that most devices have the ability for you to know how you spend your time. Do you actually spend it on the platform that you work on, or do you actually spend it on Instagram or some other app? But in general, the average American will spend at least a third of the year worth of time on the screen. And again, this doesn't even account for the usage of your laptop. This is just your phone time. The next one, this one was also in 2024. It tells us that people check their phones 159 times per day. That's about once every 6 minutes. And as you know, we're always coming up with new terms and new phobias. There's actually a new phobia. I don't know how old this phobia is, but this one is recorded in 2024. And it says that 40% of people suffer from namophobia. And that's pretty much the fear of being without your phone. I don't know when was the last time that you decided to go to the store and somehow you forgot your phone and it just seemed for a split second that it was the end of the world. I mean, that's how you communicate. We've become very dependent on our phones. However, there was also a study done that even though as a society and as Americans, even though we're more connected than ever, just think about a couple of years ago. I remember when, right around the year 2000, I don't know if you remember, when computers started to come out, whoever had a computer in their house, like they were doing very well financially. As a matter of fact, once we got our first computer in the home, I don't know if you remember, there were like these plastic covers that we would buy in California, 99 cents, and you would cover your computer with it. After you finished using it, you would cover the monitor, which was this huge box, and then you would cover also your keyboard. And so as a society, we're more connected, but also psychologists are telling us that even though we're more connected, and even though, let's say, you have friends across the country and you want to keep in touch with them, we're also the loneliest society in the Western world, right? When you go to any other country, people will usually get together and actually socialize. This past time, we went to Brazil, and one of the things that I found very interesting is that the older generation, they have like their downtown. And when you go downtown, you can actually see that they have some tables, and usually the old timers will go to downtown and they will sit and they will play games downtown, right? And still some of the old timers will go there, they will sit and they will have a good time. And so that's the older generation. However, how does the younger generation actually socialize? Back in the day, you would go to downtown and play a game with your friend. Now you sit in your computer at home and you can play virtually with anybody across the country and play those games. Before, it was in person. So anyway, we're more connected, but at the same time, we're actually the loneliest one. And so there was actually a study done where it linked our loneliness, starting with millennials, it linked our loneliness with suicide rates. And more specifically, it linked it to gun violence. So in 2023, this study came out. It says that teens with 4 hours a day of screen time are 3 times more likely to suffer anxiety or depression. Why do you think that teens nowadays are suffering more from depression than perhaps us when we were younger? Most likely, if you're a certain age and above, it's likely that you're probably not going to be depressed. You could be, but it's likely that you're not going to be depressed. But if you have a teen at home, it's very possible that they're suffering from anxiety and depression. This same study stated that in 2023, more than 27,000 Americans died by firearm suicide, over half of all gun deaths. So I don't know the statistics specifically, but in the US, we have around 50 to 55,000 deaths by gun violence. And so this includes, your mass shootings and all of that. However, 27,000 of those 50,000 deaths are simply from suicide. And so now the question is, why do we experience that as a society? And so that is where the book of Hebrews actually comes into play. In the book of Hebrews, when we begin to read, specifically the first chapter through the fourth, it tells us exactly who the audience is. And so we're going to look a little bit about the audience. One of the recurring themes that we see in the book of Hebrews is that Paul, again, I believe that Paul wrote the book. Let's just say the author for the time being. The author of Hebrews emphasizes throughout the book that this message is for those that are tired. And it continues to emphasize that to those that are tired, this message is for them. And so we're going to see a little bit of that language. But we already saw the first group of people that Hebrews addresses. It is the people that are tired, right? And as a society, we tend to avoid stopping completely and being silent. The first thing that we usually tend to do is go to our phones in order to find some sort of rest and relax. But let's look at the other audience that Paul addresses in the book of Hebrews. And so when we go to the book of Hebrews, the audience that Paul was speaking to was the Jewish nations. And this was a group of Jewish people that had just converted to Christianity. And one of the things that they were struggling with, among other things, were they were very, very discouraged. Their first discouragement was that first, when they were back in the synagogue, it was them versus the Romans. It was very simple, very clear cut. It was them versus the Romans. However, and they had this huge community, right? This huge community of Jewish people that were on their side. So it was us versus them. However, when some of these Jews converted to Christianity, it became very different, because now it wasn't them versus the Romans. Now it was them versus the synagogue, and it was them versus the Romans. And so now things began to look a little bit more, it was a little bit more weird for them. And so Paul is addressing to them. The other thing that got them discouraged as well is that they had a hard time understanding that all the rituals and the ceremonies that they had in the Old Testament, they had already been fulfilled. And when you read the book of Hebrews, you come to realize that Paul's point is that he's trying to connect the dots from what happened in the Old Testament and how it actually got fulfilled in the New Testament with Jesus. And so this was the audience that Paul was addressing. It was an audience that was very confused. They were very discouraged. And as we go through the verses here, you're going to realize that the main audience was an audience that was tired, was an audience that was confused. Not only were they being persecuted by those in the synagogue, they were also being persecuted by the Romans. And so now they felt lonely. They felt that they needed encouragement. And so I believe Paul begins to write this letter to the Hebrews. And we begin to see this language immediately in Hebrews 2, verse 1. Hebrews 2, verse 1, it says, "Therefore we must give the more earnest heed to the things we have heard, lest we drift away." Paul believed that this group of Christians were about to drift away. And again, the Hebrews were the ones that perhaps understood better the sanctuary system. They were perhaps the ones that should have had it even clearer what the mission of Jesus was. And yet, Paul finds it necessary to let them know, be careful that you don't drift away. They were just about to drift away. We continue to read in the book of Hebrews, chapter 4, verse 1. He continues to use this language. He says, "Therefore, since a promise remains of entering his rest, let us fear, lest any of you seem to have come short of it." And so this message continues to recur. Make sure that you're not coming short. Make sure that you're not drifting away. Hebrews 3:14, he says, "For we have become partakers of Christ if we hold the beginning of our confidence steadfast," or in other words, firm unto the end. Again, the message is, do not drift away. Make sure that you're firm. Make sure that you're steadfast unto the end. Don't give up. We could actually summarize the book of Hebrews in one simple sentence. Don't give up. This continues to be the recurring theme. Verse 11, again, he says, "Let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience." Again, Paul is telling them, be careful that you don't fall. Don't give up. Be diligent. And he begins to connect two dots here. He begins to talk about the Sabbath, right? He begins to talk about the Sabbath, and he also begins to tell them that the reason why they weren't able to enter into this rest was because they were disobedient. And we continue to go in verse 14. Again, this same language. He says, "Seeing then that we have a high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus the Son of God, let us hold fast our confession." The Jewish Christians at that time were very close of giving up their confession. They were very close in giving up their faith. Hebrews 10:23, he says, "Let us hold fast the confession," once again, emphasizing that. Let us hold fast the confession of our hope without wavering, for he who promised is faithful. And so he continues to give this message. And so finally, when we come to Hebrews 11, what does Paul actually do? Paul's main point is what? Don't give up. there's actually a list of Christians here from the Old Testament that did not give up. And as a matter of fact, Paul's point to the Jewish Christians was, in chapter 11, here's a list of Christians that have not given up. And what's even more interesting is that they didn't give up and they didn't see the promise actually fulfilled. And that was the whole point of chapter 11. I know you're tired. I know you're going through a tough time. You know, the synagogue that you just left is persecuting you. The Romans are persecuting you. But there's a list of people here that did not give up, and they didn't even see the promise. And so that's the chapter of faith that we know. And so if you summarize all of these phrases, so you have from Hebrews 4:1 all the way to Hebrews 13:13, the phrases are very similar. Let us take care. Let us make every effort. Let us hold fast. Let us go on. Hebrews 12:1, let us run with perseverance. Hebrews 13:13, let us go to him, then to him. And finally, in Hebrews 13:13, Paul ends with this message: don't give up, but you have to go where? You have to go to Christ. And so after speaking about all of this theme, do not give up, Paul begins to introduce the solution for actually not giving up. So how do we stop from giving up? And in Hebrews 4:9, he goes on to say, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So oftentimes when we read Exodus 20 verse 8, as Adventists, our first reaction is, we read Exodus 20 verse 8, and we say, you know what? This verse applies to all of Christianity that has forgotten the Sabbath. And while that is true, you know, Exodus 20 verse 8 does say, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. There's a couple of things that oftentimes as Adventists we forget. And that is why, remember, the Ten Commandments was not given given directly to God's people. Exodus 20 verse 8 wasn't given to the Philistines and said, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. It was never given to the Philistines, although this applied to them as well. But the Ten Commandments was being directly delivered to whom? To God's people. And to God's people, God says what? Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. So here Hebrews says, as a solution, Paul presents to the Jewish Christian the solution for their near giving up experience. And so he says there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And right after and before this, he prefaces this with this verse from the Old Testament. In Hebrews 4:7, this actually is mentioned a total of 3 times. We'll see in a bit. This phrase is mentioned throughout Hebrews a total of 3 times. And he says, again, fixes a certain day, today, saying through David, after so long a time, just as has been said before. So Paul is telling them, you know what? We have said this before. It says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And one of the things that is very interesting is that if you go in a chronological order, Hebrews is actually the last book in the Bible. Again, this chronological order is the last book in the Bible that references directly the Sabbath. And the reason why he mentions the Sabbath here is because it was a generation that was about to give up. And the solution to a generation that was about to give up was what? Remember the Sabbath day. And right before he mentions the Sabbath day, Hebrews mentions here, today, if you hear his voice, what is he actually telling them? If you hear his voice today, and even as John in the book of Revelation says, if you have an ear, let him hear. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And the very next verse is, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. And again, here's a quick shot of the 3 times that this phrase is mentioned in the book of Hebrews. And again, when you look at some of the Jewish literature, whenever something is mentioned 3 times, you bet that is very, very, very important. So Hebrews 3:7, same phrase. Today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. Hebrews 3:15, in the same chapter, he says again, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your hearts. And then he even adds, as in the rebellion, alluding to the rebellion that happened in the Old Testament. Then Hebrews 4:7, right after that, again, he appoints a certain day. He says, today, if you hear his voice, do not harden your heart. Now, when we go to inspiration, Ellen White uses a very common phrase, and she says that the Sabbath is the golden clasp between us and God. And so this is, we're going to look at that in a bit. She says the Sabbath was made for man and given to man as a blessing. So I don't know how many of you know what's a golden clasp. I did not know what it was, and so I went on a rabbit hole on the internet to try and find what was a clasp. And so it turns out that a clasp was something like this. It was usually the thing that you would find in a treasure box, and it was that little brass thing that kept it together. There's also some other photos. This was also called the golden clasp. In other words, the golden clasp was anything that was used to keep something together, right? And so this golden clasp expression in between the 1800s and the 1900s was a very common expression, so much so that even Christians, Protestant Christians actually use this expression. And so we're going to look at this expression used by a Protestant Christian in a bit. But look what she says. She says, not merely as a form, talking about the Sabbath, but as a test question, an everlasting memorial, that God made the world and all things that are therein in 6 days and rested upon the seventh. Wherefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it. She goes on to say, and this is where she uses the expression, the Sabbath sign is the covenant between God and man. So the Sabbath is a covenant between God and man. And then she goes on to say, it is the golden clasp which unites man to God in supreme obedience and reverence. So the Sabbath, in other words, it's more than a day that we stop doing our regular work, is more than a day that we stop doing our own things. It's actually a day that unites us with God. But in order for us to unite ourselves with God, again, and we're going to see this later in our study today, we must stop and listen to the voice of God. And so we're going to look at that in a bit. So she says it is the golden clasp. The Sabbath is a golden clasp which unites man to God. Now let's go ahead and compare how was this expression also used with Protestant Christians. All right. So this quote that she wrote here, this was the 1900s, but this quote is also used in reference to Sunday, all right, to Sunday. And this, we're going to go to, this gentleman's name was Henry Wadsworth, and he wrote this in 1840. And this was his vision of what Sunday was, right? So for Protestant Christians, Sunday is simply what? One of the many things, but one of the things that he says here is Sunday is the golden clasp. He uses the same expression, but he says that Sunday is a golden clasp that binds together the volume of the week, right? And so to him, Sunday was simply a way to summarize what actually happened in the week. Later on in the 1900s, Ellen White, I believe, echoes and actually responds to this statement by taking it a step further. And now she's talking about the seventh-day Sabbath. Sabbath is not only a summary of what happened in the week. It's not simply a day that you stop and you take a break. It's something a lot more meaningful. Anybody can stop a day, right? You and I can choose to pick any day, and we can stop and say, this is going to be the day that we're going to actually pause and take a break. But the Sabbath is something more significant, because the Sabbath is the golden clasp which unites you with God. And so how can I unite myself with God? So Hebrews 4:11, once again, it says, let us therefore be diligent to enter that rest, lest anyone fall according to the same example of disobedience. So what was going on in the Old Testament? What was this disobedience that was taking place? Again, in Hebrews 10:36, it says, for you have need of endurance, so that after you have done the will of God, you may receive the promise. So what was the will of God? In Hebrews 3:18 through 19, he says, "And to whom did he swear that they would not enter into his rest? But to those who did not obey, so we see that they could not enter in because of unbelief." What was the reason why the children of Israel were not able to actually enter into that rest? After all, the Israelites did not work on the seventh day. They didn't. They had that very clear. They did not work. They did all of the preparations. So why couldn't they enter? In Testimonies for the Church, it says at the very beginning of the fourth commandment, the Lord said, "Remember." He knew that amid the multitude of cares and perplexities, man would be tempted to excuse himself or would forget its sacred importance. Do you believe that as Adventists and Christians, we perhaps have forgotten the sacred importance of the Sabbath? And I'm not just saying, coming to church, not working on the Sabbath day, but perhaps we have forgotten the real reason behind the Sabbath. And so now, what we're going to be looking now at for the next few slides here is going to be, how do we actually create a space in which we can come in contact with God and have a closer communion with Him on the Sabbath day? How do we create that space? How do we create that space? Number one, we see here is that very simple, we have to prepare ahead, right? We have to prepare ahead. In Exodus 16:22, God said, "Tomorrow is the Sabbath day, a holy Sabbath to the Lord." And so he said, we have to prepare, bake what you will bake today, and boil what you will boil. I was actually reading, there's a Messianic Jew, and he was talking about what the Sabbath means to him specifically. And he said that the best way that he can explain that to a non-Christian is that the Sabbath day is like a holiday. The Sabbath day is, we're all familiar with Christmas. Think about Christmas. What happens when people are coming over for Christmas or let's say for Thanksgiving? What do you do before everybody comes to your house? What do? We prepare. You're not preparing your meal right when people are there, right? You're preparing ahead of time. You make sure the house is clean. You're actually creating a space so you can spend time with the people that you love. The Sabbath is the same way. He actually took it a step further and says, for us, the Sabbath day is kind of like a wedding. You make all of your preparations ahead of time, and so when the Sabbath comes, you're ready to actually enjoy that time. And so again, God's talking to His people, and He says, whatever you need to go ahead and bake it today. In other words, bake it on Friday. Boil what you need to boil. Be prepared ahead of time. She goes on to say, on Friday, see that all clothing is in readiness, and that all the cooking is done. Let the boots be blacked and the baths taken. So kind of like a wedding. You take your bath, you put in your best clothes. And the other one is what we were talking about in the beginning. The Bible does not talk about, there is no commandment, and I'm sure you're aware of that, there is no commandment that says put your phone away on the Sabbath day or avoid your phone. But there's something else that would be equal to that. She goes on to say the Sabbath is not given to pleasure seeking or to any other worldly employment. Before the setting of the sun, let all secular work be laid aside and all secular papers be put out of sight. So again, in the 1800s, 1900s, no phones, but what was some of the things that they did have? Newspapers, they had some magazines, and so her whole point is, in order to create a space where you can actually meet with God, where you can spend quality time with God, what do we need to do? Put out any of those distractions. I would suggest that the phone can be one of those many distractions, right? She goes on to say, parents, explain your work and its purpose to your children and let them share in your preparation. Again, when we're preparing for the Sabbath, all she's saying is get the whole family involved in this preparation. It's not a thing that is to be left just to the parents. It's something that we're all a part of. And now she says something that really struck me. And I believe that as a society, we tend to have a struggle with this. After you do this, she says, welcome the Lord's day with quietness of mind. I don't know if you have experienced this, but after you've had a long day of work, even when you go to bed, how many of you are actually thinking about the issues and the things that you need to take care of, even when you're asleep? Right? We go to sleep, and I know some people that even acknowledge it. I try to go to sleep, but I'm still thinking on whatever was going on. And even dreaming. Yes, that is correct. And even dreaming. And so what is the whole point of making these preparations for the Sabbath? The whole point for making all of these preparations for the Sabbath is that when the Sabbath comes, you can have a quietness of mind. And you can be at peace with God, knowing that everything has been taken care of. And there's another one that is very important, and I believe that this goes without saying. And the third one is, go to church. Why? Leviticus 23, verse 3, it says, the seventh day is a Sabbath, a solemn rest, a holy convocation. You shall do no work on it. So one of the commandments that God gave his people was very simple. You do your preparation, and you do what else? You go to a holy convocation, you spend time with like-minded believers. And we know that Jesus even had this custom, right? He actually did this. Luke 4:16, it tells us that Jesus went on a Sabbath day, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day and stood up and read. So he was actually going to church. There's actually something else that we are told that we should actually engage in on the Sabbath, and that is very simple. It says, do good. The Sabbath is not intended to be a period of useless inactivity. So when on the Sabbath, it's not a day that you just kind of do nothing and just sit around and get bored. It's a day that has purpose and meaning. She says, the toil that gains a livelihood must cease, no labor for worldly pleasure, but we're supposed to be something else, do something else. Devote those sacred hours to healthful rest, to worship, and to holy deeds. And so what are those holy deeds? She goes on to say that we need to do what? There will always be duties which have to be performed on the Sabbath day for the relief of suffering humanity. And the other one, I believe that the kids and the young people will actually enjoy this, and that is go to nature. The Sabbath was not intended for you to spend, those 24 hours just in church, right? What was the whole purpose of the Sabbath as well? To call our attention to God. It says the Sabbath calls our thoughts to nature and brings us into communion with the Creator. And the whole point is, she goes on to say, we still may hear his voice who talked with Adam in the cool of the day. And as we behold his power in nature, we find comfort, for the word that created all things is that which speaks to the life, which speaks life to the soul. So all of these things that we just talked about, the things that we need to do and put away with in order to create this space, in order to have communion with God, is for us to have quietness of mind on the Sabbath, and also for us to listen even closer to the voice of God. Oftentimes, when we're talking with people and counseling people, the question usually comes, it's very hard for me to listen to the Word of God, to the voice of God. And don't you think that one of the reasons why we struggle a lot is because perhaps we're not putting away the distractions in order to actually sit and listen? And as we read in the first verse, perhaps we're struggling to be still and know that God is God. She goes on to say, the Sabbath was made to be a blessing to man by calling his mind from secular labor to contemplate the goodness of the glory of God. What is the whole purpose of the Sabbath? It's not only the fact that we stop working our regular work during the week. Even more important is to call our minds away from the secular labor, whatever issues that we had during the week, whatever problems that we had at work, is to call the mind from secular labor and to contemplate on the goodness of God. It is very possible that even though we're not working on the Sabbath day, perhaps we're still thinking of some project that is due Monday, right? And so it is to call the mind, our mind, and to contemplate on the glory of God. And finally, one of the things that the Bible is very clear on is that the Sabbath is supposed to be special. How do we make it special? Isaiah 58, 13 through 14 says, if you turn away your foot from the Sabbath and call the Sabbath a delight, not doing your own ways, then you shall delight yourself in the Lord. The way that you and I can actually delight ourselves with the Lord is doing what? not doing our own ways, actually stopping, doing whatever we do and actually delighting ourselves in the Lord. The book Our Father Cares says, before the setting of the sun, let the members of the family assemble to read God's word, to sing and to pray. So even before the Sabbath is, before sunset is closed, get together with your family, begin to sing, begin to read the word of God. She goes on to say, all should have a special suit. So just like the Jewish writer was, as we mentioned earlier, said that the Sabbath was kind of like a wedding. When we come to the Sabbath, what are we supposed to wear? She says we're supposed to wear the best piece of clothing that you have. Use that piece of clothing because it's a special day. She says all should have a special Sabbath suit to be worn when attending service in God's house. Why? Because it's a special day. When you're meeting with somebody special, let's say that you and your wife, for those that are married, you and your wife are going for date night. Are you going to put on your best clothes in order to, well, I hope you are, putting your best clothes, perhaps your best shoes, your best cologne in order to go out on a date with your wife? Or are you going in Crocs and the clothes that you use in the home? No, you go with your best clothes. So the same with the Sabbath. And now here's a tough one. In order to create that space where you're actually connecting with God, there's something even more important. And perhaps one of the things that prevent us from actually connecting with God, and that is to reconcile relationships. When you have issues with somebody, your mind is always, going back to whatever struggles you're having with that individual. She goes on to say there's another work that should receive attention on the preparation day. So yes, in order to create the space, she says, on this day, all difference between brethren, whether in the family or in the church, should be put away. Let all bitterness and wrath and malice be expelled from the soul, in a humble spirit confess your faults one to another and pray one for another. So if you had something with somebody or somebody did something to you before coming to the Sabbath, in order to create that space to have this special moment with God, talk to the person. Hash it out. Whatever you need to say, talk it over with them. And when you come to the Sabbath, you're actually going to have that peace of mind. And finally, do not do any business. Remember that every moment is consecrated holy time. The Sabbath is God's time. And we can also learn from the lesson that we find in Nehemiah 10:31. If the peoples of the land brought wares or any grain to sell on the Sabbath day, we would not buy it from them on the Sabbath. So any business, put it away, then do it on the Sabbath. And so before we conclude, I would like us to go back and look at some of the things that we read at the beginning. Any work that is neglected until the commandments of the holy time should remain undone until the Sabbath is passed. Oftentimes, whenever I read this statement, it seemed a little harsh. Sometimes you're doing something, you don't have enough time. But did you know that when you understand that the reason why God commands us to actually, if you're doing something, just stop. Even if you did not finish it, stop in the middle of it, let it go. It is actually a peace of mind, right? Because you know that as soon as the Sabbath comes, whatever trial you had or whatever you were working on, as difficult as it might have been, it's time to stop and you pick it up, on Sunday. And so this is one of the ways that if you're actually struggling, make sure that if you're doing something and the Sabbath has come, just put it aside. God is actually saying, let it go until Sunday. So what is the call that Hebrews has for us? Again, for a society that is ready to give up, for a society that does not have a moment of silence, for a society that is bombarded with ads on YouTube, for a society that has a lot of distractions, Hebrews 4:7 tells us, today, if you hear your voice, do not harden your hearts. And also remember that right after that, he goes on to say, there still remains a Sabbath day for the people of God. So I would like to invite you, I know most of us here, we keep the Sabbath, right? But perhaps we have forgotten that in order for us to really connect with God is not simply to stop doing what we're doing, but it's actually making the effort to spend time with God, putting away all distractions so we can actually have this connection. And remember, for a society that is struggling to be connected, for a society that is lonely, Paul's solution, according to the Bible, is what? Don't give up, and there is a Sabbath for the people of God so you can rest. Amen.